Moving on to the third panel of the evening, we have with us Jonathan Gill Harris and Omar Musa, with Chintan Girish Modi as the moderator, on a panel titled Navigating in Between, where they will be exploring the ideas of race, gender, and diaspora through verse and prose. I shall quickly introduce our panelists for this session. Jonathan Gill Harris was born in New Zealand and educated in England, and has lived in the US for over 20 years before moving to India in 2011. His day job is as a professor of Shakespeare. He has written 5 books on the English Renaissance drama and the ideas of the foreign. He is also an avid follower of Hindi cinema, and his articles on Bollywood and globalization have been published in the Hindustan Times. Jonathan's book, The First Firangis, was published last year, and he is currently writing a new book titled Shakespeare Masala: How an English Playwright Became Indian. He now lives in Delhi, where he is the Professor of English and Dean of Academic Affairs at Ashoka University. Omar Musa, our second panelist, is a Malaysian-Australian author, rapper, and poet from Australia. He has appeared on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's show Q&A and has performed at TEDx Sydney at the Sydney Opera House. His debut novel, Here Come the Dogs, was longlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, the International Dublin Literary Award, and Omar was also named one of the Young Novelists of 2015 by the Sydney Morning Herald. Chintan Girish Modi, who will be moderating the session, is a Mumbai-based freelance writer. He writes on art, cinema, and popular culture for The Hindu, and a weekly humor column called Mumbai Diary for the Friday Times, Pakistan. He has worked on research projects with the Institute of South Asian Research and Exchange in Kathmandu, and the Shrishti School of Art, Design and Technology, and on several editorial projects with Orient Black Swan, Oxford University Press, and the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. His interests lie in conversations about cultural diversity, peace building, and cross-border dialogues between India and Pakistan. He has received fellowships and scholarships from Seeds of Peace, Initiators of Change, the Seagull Foundation for the Arts, and Prava, among others. Thank you.
Thanks for being here to listen to this, which I hope will be a very interesting panel on race, diaspora, and gender. I know it's strange that we have a panel on gender and there's no woman here up on stage, so I apologize for that. But we'll make sure that the women are the ones asking the questions when it comes to the audience round. So I'd love for Omar to start. Omar is a poet who I discovered thanks to his YouTube channel, which is really fascinating. I mean, the way in which he does with poetry what very few people can do is something that you'll see without really describing it. I want you to have the full-blown effect of it. So, Omar.
Okay, I'm going to perform a poem. It's actually a rap that I took from my upcoming album, which is going to be called Gutter and Gold. Australian hip-hop represent here in Mumbai. So, this is just a little story, I suppose. I used to pray 5 times a day when I was younger. I'd hear my dad calling me to prayer in the morning. And if I wouldn't wake, he'd tug me on the toes, sprinkle water on my face. I would know it was dawn. And it's time to wake up, wash face and feet. Wishing I was still asleep, I would hear him recite from the Arabic language. It sounded beautiful, but I couldn't understand it. Because we only spoke Malay and English in our home. A vivid disconnect, but I know I'm not alone. Even so, it was a moment of peace, but the problem was I never believed. He would say, there is no compulsion in our faith, but if I challenged anything, he'd go into a rage. So I just went silent, and I seethed all the while, just wanted reprieve. Man, this is too hard to say. It's getting too hard to say. It's too hard to say. It's getting too hard to say. I swear it's too hard to say. You see, some gonna hate, some gonna relate, but I'm only trying to find my way, find my way. Some gonna relate, maybe one day we'll find our way. So I left home quietly, broke free, stepping out in society. So relieved I was sipping on a cup, more than happy enough to escape from the sermons and the piety. I was raised in a persecuted sect that preached pacifism and community respect. It just wasn't for me. But my heritage was something that I wouldn't reject. And my country, Australia, had plans for me. My name, Omar bin Musa, I'm proud of it. But people bristle at the very sound of it. Every time I'm stepping on a Qantas, treated like a bomb threat. Every time the internet warriors are on deck with the death threats, or there's a terrorist act, see me as accomplice. Just as bad, the well-meaning what in my analysis and the Islamic historical context. I tell them, this is too hard to say. It's getting too hard to say. It's too hard to say. It's getting too hard to say. I swear it's too hard to say. You see, some gonna hate, some gonna relate. I'm only trying to find my way. Some gonna relate. Maybe one day we'll find our way. Yeah. I'm trapped in the middle again. Trapped in the middle again. I'm trapped in the middle again. I'm trapped in the middle again. You see, my atheist mates think it's something I can jettison, like a dead star that I used to wish upon. They don't get it. You can't just wave a wand and just like magic, that part of you is gone. It's not as simple as that. Religion is culture, and culture and rap's all the parts of yourself that you didn't even know were there. The way I do poems with flair, I learn it from the preachers, the way they do speeches, the incandescence that I seek in my art, caring about the poor, equality and charity. I learned from reading the Quran and paying zakat, but they say, you could have learned that outside religion. The fact is that I didn't. I'm trapped again, too Muslim for them, and not enough for them. Where the hell will it end? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Omar. So we were having a little chat before this, and Omar was sharing how difficult it was for him to write about this piece because it involved him engaging with his faith, and he really thinks of himself as a secular Muslim, which is a bit of a difficult identity to talk about. So do you want to share about this idea of being trapped in the middle, which you brought up in this particular performance, and not just about being Muslim and secular, but also being of Malaysian and Australian descent at the same time?
Sure. I think I grew up like a lot of people in Australia, which is a country largely made up of migrants. I grew up in between worlds. I call it the hyphen generation, people who grew up on the hyphen between like Malaysian and Australian, Samoan hyphen Australian, African hyphen Australian. And you know, a lot of people kind of assume that you're going to feel very dislocated by this experience, and that, you know, is something that I definitely felt when I was growing up, alongside a lot of racism, which Australians are becoming very famous for. But at the same time, I also saw it as a very enriching experience because I could kind of draw from different worlds. And I learned that you could own a liminal space in between cultures, and that there was something very exciting and illuminating and enriching about that. And then growing up as a Muslim in Australia, I suppose, you know, you felt a little bit of a benign discomfort growing up in the 80s and 90s. You're always going to feel like an outsider in a country where the measuring stick that you have to measure yourself against is a white, heterosexual, kind of Anglo-Celtic culture. But then after September 11th, I suppose, that's when things really changed in a major way, and you started feeling as if I started feeling, and a lot of my friends started feeling, as if we had been defined as the enemy. We suddenly realized, wow, we are the ones, us young Muslim men, we are the ones that they hate. We're the ones they don't want to be here. We are the ones that they're demonizing. And so on one side, one part of me wanted to own that heritage and be very proud of it. But the other side of me, which is, I suppose, the secular side, I was never really a believer, you know. So I was kind of trapped, and I've tried to explore this space of being a cultural Muslim that kind of puts you offside with atheists and Muslims alike, because Muslims will tell you, no, there's no such thing. You cannot be a secular Muslim in the way that you could be a cultural Jew or something like that. And so it's this difficult space to navigate, and writing this song was hard for me as well, because there aren't that many Muslim people in public life in Australia with a public face, and so all of a sudden you're supposed to represent these diverse communities which are so disparate, you know, because Muslims are not just one thing. And all of a sudden you're supposed to be the face of this,
Yes.
and to comment on Islamic issues all the time, and things that you don't know much about at all. And oftentimes you want to say, yeah, okay, my name's Omar bin Musa, but maybe you should go and talk to an expert in the Middle East, you know, or someone who's an expert on Islamic history at the Australian National University. Maybe you don't come to me first. So it is a difficult space to negotiate for sure.
Thank you for that. I wanted to add another layer to that. Apart from being Muslim, would you say that the experience of being a Muslim man is also something that you would like to talk about? Because one often reads about the kind of treatment or the kind of representation that faced by Muslim women living in Western countries, but the whole idea of, you know, equating a Muslim man with someone who's
Dangerous and
dangerous,
violent,
yeah,
potentially
exactly.
a rapist. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of these stereotypes in Australia, and for a while I battled against that, and I said, oh, no, I don't have to represent anything. I can just do my thing and ignore this whole dilemma, because why should I be a representative? But now I see that Islamophobia has grown a lot in Australia over the past 15 years, and there's been this kind of collective madness in Australia growing and growing, and kind of a parade of shamelessness and vulgarity in the Australian government, or successive Conservative governments, that has played upon this fear of Muslims. And so actually I think maybe I do have a responsibility as somebody who has thought about these issues and is in public life, to just show that there are so many different facets to the Muslim experience, whatever the hell that is, and that we are all different people, and it's not one essentialized identity. And by adding nuance and complexity to these narratives, you reclaim the narrative that is often used against you.
Thanks. Gil, you were sharing that you two have had a difficult relationship with your Jewish identity. Did that really come into play when you were negotiating being a New Zealander who tries to become Indian when you came here? Yeah, you could read that particular passage, and maybe even about Sarmad, because he was, yeah.
So I like to tell people I'm not a Jew, I'm Jew-ish. So this is an interlude from my book, The First Firangis, which is a study of foreigners who came to India in the 15th and 16th centuries before the behemoth of colonialism got started. And they came not to conquer or command, but simply to seek a different life, often a better life from what they were experiencing in Europe, which at that time was something of an economic backwater, a place of incredible religious schism. There were many religious dissidents who were leaving, there were many economic refugees, there were even some sexual dissidents, we might call them, who came to India in the hope of a better life. But I intersperse these chapters about actual historical figures with interludes from my own experiences of being a Farangi adapting to life in India. And this is an interlude called On Swerving. Living in India demands that the body as much as the mind become adept in the art of swerving. Swerving is epidemic throughout the subcontinent. Locals as well as visitors complain about drivers' lack of what they call lane discipline. The tendency, even when they're clearly demarcated lanes, to lurch willy-nilly between them. But lane and discipline is of a piece with Indians' pervasive tendency to refuse the constraint of one track, physically and verbally. Indians are, by habit, as much as inclination, swervers. This is particularly so in Delhi. The ubiquity of swerving was brought home to me when I first visited the city. Often I would eavesdrop on conversations that, like a Delhi car repeatedly weaving in and out of supposedly discrete lanes, lurched from English to Hindi to Punjabi and back again. I'd studied Shuddh Hindi before moving to Delhi, but that pure tongue bore scant resemblance to any language I heard spoken here. Doordarshan is not the norm. The problem with what I'd learned is that it stayed too confined to one Sanskritized lane. My better education by far has been courtesy of Bollywood and its music, whose language is a mongrel blend of Hindi, Urdu, English, Punjabi, and other tongues. Listening to my car radio, weaving between lanes of road and language, I've learned the demented lyrics for a song from the film Dedi, Emotional Atyachar, which hurtle between Bhojpuri, Hindi, and English. Bola bola, why did you ditch me? Zindagi bhi le le, yaar kill me. And I picked up choice English expressions such as BT matte yaar, don't give me a BT or a bad trip.
Oh Lord.
Exactly. Swerving between languages occurs not just at the level of thought or word choice, it's also an embodied phenomenon, as I learned early in my life. My Warsaw-born, Jerusalem-raised mother, though fluent in English, would shift between several languages, often in the space of a single sentence. She would intersperse her remarks with snippets of Hebrew, labriot, literally to health whenever I sneezed, laila tov, meaning good night when I went to bed. As the Hebrew tripped off her tongue, she would hold her head and move her eyebrows differently from how she did in English. And she would always count in Polish, jeden, dwa, tirci, cztery, pięć, touching her fingers in a way that she wouldn't in English. When she changed languages, therefore, her body would change too, the shape of her lips and mouth, as she produced sounds different from those of English, her expressions and gestures as she swerved into Hebrew and Polish. The art of verbal swerving represents to me an exhilarating form of code switching, the freedom to cross borders of imagination as well as language. It has impressed on me how there's always more than one choice for expressing a thought, and that a thought can subtly change and grow by moving into other languages. But this freedom paradoxically entails an element of submission. It means abiding by theatrical scripts, not of one's own making, scripts that are of the body as much as of language. Swerving into a new language obliges you not only to observe its rules of grammar and syntax, but also to perform the body languages that come with it, stylized facial expressions, postures, movements of the hands, and so on. As I haltingly acquired English with its kitschy of diverse tongues, I was struck by how my own movements between languages prompted my body to conform to multiple scripts. Without realizing it, I'd started to waggle my head when conversing with people. And in my car, when encountering Delhi's bad drivers, I began raising my hand in that universal backhanded splay-fingered "Tu kya kar raha hai, you bloody sala" gesture, accompanied by an expression, of course, of deeply aggrieved hurt. I had, in short, become a pucker Delhi driver come swerver.
Thank you. You want to respond to that?
I love that idea of swerving. I think it's a great metaphor, and it's also something that I think we were talking about before. In both of our books, we kind of jump between styles and forms in order to keep the audience a little bit uncomfortable and uneasy. And I think we sort of swerve between the forms. And part of that for me was to reflect the fact that my characters, in my novel at least, they are all living in between worlds or partake in several different worlds. And so I wanted to come up with a form that would reflect that. So I kind of broke up the book into 3 distinct sections. So one character, his story is told from using first-person poetry, because I wanted it to sort of mirror an up-close lens. If I was thinking about it cinematically, it's right up there. You can see the pores, you can see the grit, you can smell his sweat. And then with another character, I wanted it to be more panoramic in its view of Australian society, so I used the third-person prose so that it might be actually more like a hovering eyeball above Australian society. And then the third character is quite a mysterious character who is the most trapped, and I decided to kind of combine both, and maybe that would mirror the effect of a tracking camera over someone's shoulder, so that you are close to this character and see what they see, but you're still at a slight remove from them. But I sort of wanted to have no rules, to say to hell with the rules, even though there was this kind of overall structure, but then sometimes with no apologies I would just drop into the poetry, or drop into street slang, or drop into Macedonian language, or Samoan language, or Urdu even. So I had to research a lot, and just to kind of mimic this polyglot nature of our world and of Australia, and the multiple worlds that we live in.
No, it was very much the same for me. When I came to write this book, I wanted to experiment with form. I'd written a series of academic books that were, by academic standards, very successful because about 5 people had read them. But here in India, I had to find a very different audience. But it was also an interesting opportunity to experiment formally. Partly because I had a very real problem that I had to deal with. Writing about these 15th and 16th century Firangis, these migrants who came to India, there wasn't a huge archive that I could draw on. There were the equivalent, the archival equivalent of vapor trails and ripples, suggestions of these characters and their lives. But there weren't diaries or autobiographies that I could fall back on. And so my solution was to treat my own body as an archive, which isn't to suggest that my body or its experiences has been exactly the same as 15th and 16th century men and women who came to live in India. In fact, it's in some ways remarkably different. Yet at the same time, the experience of migration, I think we can often forget that it is one not only of cultural and linguistic dislocation, but also of deeply embodied dislocation as well. Our bodies, we are used to thinking in the 21st century, in a very sort of privatized, individualistic age, are simply these units, these capsules. But in fact, our bodies are nodes within much larger dynamic ecologies. Our bodies are always affected by the environments we live in. And migrants are particularly aware of that, in as much as the food that we eat, the new climates that we expose ourselves to, the new viral loads that we have to take on and get accustomed to, all in their own way colonize our bodies and transform us. So the opportunity to write about my own body was something that I seized as a way of beginning to think about the embodied experiences of the characters in my book. But it was also an opportunity to experiment formally by moving between genres that are normally regarded as absolutely separate. Historical scholarship on the one hand, and a much more sort of informal autobiographical style on the other. And what we might call speculative historical fiction on the third hand. And formally for me, a little bit as for Omar, this experiment meant that I could also convey something of the dislocation of being a migrant in an in-between space with all the vicissitudes that that entails. That in-betweenness can be at times very difficult, but it can also be massively enabling. So I think we're often inclined to think of in-between as neither fish nor fowl, sort of caught somewhere in a limbo. But there's a way in which that in-between land needn't be just the tragic space of Toba Tek Singh, caught in that no man's land between two discrete, clear entities. There's a way in which that no man's land can also be remarkably enabling. And perhaps we can talk about how.
I wanted to ask you something about that. So while you talk about the challenges of this in-betweenness, the in-betweenness largely is something that you celebrate in the book and in the lives of the people that you've documented. But would you say that your gender and race as a Firangi, as you put it, place you in a certain context which might not be the experience of other so-called Firangis? I'm thinking of the girl from Tanzania in Bangalore recently and the horrific sexual assault that she had to face. She was someone, like you, she too wanted to make India home, and there was a certain experience that she had which was very different from yours, and hers was not the only experience. We do know that, while Indians talk about how they face racism in the West, Indians are also deeply racist towards people in the Northeast, towards people from Africa. That's one thing. The other theme that Omar talked about, which I'd love for you to also take off on, is the representation of Muslims. You have this lovely piece about the Western imagination of the harem. I mean, I'm using the word Western because you use it in the book, But you also sort of slightly critique what Dalrymple does with that, so it would be nice to hear about that. And also Sarmad, if you can fit that in somehow. There's so much awesomeness in your book that...
Why, thank you. So, first of all, let me address the question of access to in-betweenness. I think you're absolutely right that there is a way in which the sort of access I describe here is not automatic, and that there are ways in which, I wouldn't say exactly my race and gender, because I think race and gender are always problematic and elusive and contradictory identities, but rather the way in which my race and gender are assigned to me here in India, that give me access to certain privileged spaces that certainly the Tanzanian woman who experienced what she did in Bangalore, and many other visitors to the country, especially from Africa, but from other parts of the world, experience. This is the thing. Every time you try to make some sort of general claim about India, you can immediately contradict it by an equally forceful claim that states the opposite. On the one hand, India is a country that historically has experienced syncretism of an unrivaled order. It has afforded people mobility, that's always a tricky term, but afforded people mobility of a kind that is at times extraordinary. On the other hand, simultaneously, India has been a rigidly conservative society where if you are assigned an identity, you can be locked into it forever, and there's no possibility of mobility whatsoever. The name of the session includes race and gender, but I think it's significant that caste has fallen off somehow here. Yes. And is there a more fierce and harsh marker of identity than caste in the subcontinent? So when I talk about my in-betweenness as a space that I can celebrate, and that I can celebrate it because India, or rather local traditions, have celebrated in-betweenness, I have to be cognizant of the fact that there are all sorts of other ways in which in-betweenness is a very, very difficult and precarious state to be in. For instance, I write about 2 women in the book, and I wanted to write about many more women, but it was particularly hard to find even a vapor trail suggesting the presence of Farangi women. The only place where I was able to find hints of women who had immigrated to India before the age of colonialism was in Mughal records of the harem. And contrary to the Western assumption that the harem was basically a space of sexual pleasure for the Mughal, the harem was in fact a very interesting counter space to the public space of Mughal political culture. That could be very harsh to women in some ways, but could also give women a certain amount of protection from the ravages of husbands, etc. The harem was, to a large extent, a women-controlled space, a very cultural and literate space. The harem was a cross-cultural space, a multi-linguistic space, a cross-class space. The soldiers who guarded the space of the harem were women. Some of them were eunuchs, but it's not the case, as is often assumed, that it was only eunuchs who guarded the harem. There were migrant women from Abyssinia, from Central Asia, who guarded the harem. But I wrote about 2 women, one from Portugal and one from Armenia, who led very different lives in Mughal harems. They were both named Bibi Juliana, interestingly. And the first Bibi Juliana was the daughter of Akbar's Qazi, an Armenian Christian. And she was married to another Armenian and seemed to lead a rather sad life in the harem because her children were taken away from her and raised by one of the future Jahangir's wives. And she died very young. The second Juliana was a Portuguese born as a slave, as far as we can tell. After the Mughals conquered Hooghly in 1632, they enslaved many of the Portuguese there. And the second Juliana was born in about 1656 as a slave girl and grew up in the Mughal court. But she rose to become the political advisor of Aurangzeb's son Alam, who later became Bahadur Shah, the Mughal. And she became so powerful that she was granted a jagir, several jagirs near Delhi. There's a place, if you know Delhi very well, called Juliana Sarai, which is named for her. So the harem could in fact be an empowering space. But I really don't want to suggest for a second, and I don't suggest in this book,
Yes.
that it was easy to be a Farangi migrating to India. There were all sorts of opportunities and possibilities that presented themselves to certain people in certain contexts, but there were all sorts of dead ends that people met as well as migrants, and women in particular bore the brunt of these dead ends.
Thank you. Omar, I wanted to chat with you about this gorgeous piece called The Fireflies, which you dedicate to what you call the survivors, the eccentrics, those who never let coolness whitewash their madness. I found that quite amazing. You know, they're celebrating those who do not fit in with the norm, and that's the theme of this panel as well. Navigating the in-betweenness. So what is it that draws you to these people's stories? Elsewhere you've talked about how the storyteller is also this dispeller of sorrows and worries, right?
Right.
What is it that draws you to the stories of these people? And is that about your own in-betweenness that sort of draws you?
Well, I always have this idea that the cultural centre of a society is constantly shifting. So oftentimes people who are considered very marginal or considered outsiders at a certain point become the dead centre of what that society is about. And so I'm always intrigued by these people, and I guess because I consider myself to be an outsider in a way, and when we talk about growing up in between worlds, I feel like I sort of have always embodied that, because I grew up between religious and secular, Asian and Australian, and even between country and city. My hometown, Queanbeyan, in Australia, its motto is city living, country benefits. And so I kind of grew up in between these places, and I felt like I was in a special spot to be able to interrogate them. But what I was more intrigued in was the responses of different migrants to their situations, and whether, not the choice they had made, but whether they had been able to choose their choice. That was something I was really interested in. And then how they responded to growing up in Australia. So in my book, I tried to represent a span of that. So there's three young men dealing with powerlessness in their own ways, and showing and sort of representing toxic Australian masculinity in a certain way as well. And one person decides that he will completely reject the idea of Australia as a migrant, and he will return to the homeland. I don't think that happens that often in Australia. But then another person says, no, Australia may be ugly, but it's the only Australia I know, so I might as well grow some roots. And then the third person decides to burn the whole fucking place down, and is very, very destructive. And so there are these kind of myriad ways people respond to being outcasts or outsiders. But this particular poem you're talking about, I wrote it for a bunch of Aboriginal kids I was working with. I work a lot with kids, and I was up in northern New South Wales, and it's a place called, a lot of the kids came from the Mish, which is a town based on a mission town, when the missionaries came to Australia, and they would gather all these tribes and pretty much just force them into an English style of education in a mission. And so a lot of these places are very underprivileged and disadvantaged. And I was trying to write for these kids in the hope that my words might uplift them or encourage them to use words as well to express themselves. Because in Malay society, a storyteller is named Penglipur Lara. As you know, it's a dispeller of worries or a reliever of sorrows. And it's not just your own sorrows that you're relieving, it's the audience's as well. So I just wrote that for some kids I was working with, really. And funnily enough, I got a call about this. This is kind of funny. I got a call about a year and a half ago, and it was it was an unknown number, and it was a very recognisable Australian voice on the other end, saying, that poem, Fireflies, I bloody love that poem, and this and that. And we were sort of going on about the poem. And I said, sorry, who is this? And it turned out it was a Russell Crowe, who loves Australian poetry, and once upon a time wanted to be a poet, but I think he took the more lucrative road and became a Hollywood actor. But so that's an epic name drop. I apologise for that. But it's not every day that the gladiator himself gives you a call saying that he likes your poem that he wrote for a bunch of kids you were working with.
Kaushik, how much time do we have? I want to know if we can chat a little more or if we should start with the audience questions. Sorry? Oh, we have lots of time. Fantastic. Is there something in what he said that you want to respond to before I ask you something?
Yeah, I want to point out Russell Crowe was originally a New Zealander.
All right. You can answer.
I'd like them to
Read a little bit more of the poetry. Maybe we could finish with that.
Okay.
One more rap.
Why don't you do Fireflies, if you can?
Okay.
My heart.
I do know it by heart, yeah. Are you sure? Okay, right.
Yeah.
Sure. You asked for it. She said, as a child I lived in the mountains. I used to collect fireflies in a jar and use the light to read my books. I said, what a beautiful world it is. She said, now when I return to the mountains, there are no fireflies left. And I said, what a heartbreaking world it is. So when our heroes grow old and our dreamers go mad, when our songbirds go silent and fires burn on each corner, I live for the little wins. When there are footsteps in the hallways and I don't know whose they are, whether lover or torturer, ally or assassin, I live for the little wins. When there are hands over ears and tape over mouths, when I no longer know if I prefer to be awake or asleep, the silence of the undertow or the crashing of waves on a reef, when they promise us everything and they treat us like nothing. I live for the little wins. Like when you eat a meal and straight afterwards you realize that what you just ate, shit, that was exactly what you felt like. Like when mangoes are $9 a box. I actually don't know whether that's cheap here. I did this poem in Thailand recently, they were like, $9, it's extortion. Anyway, like a surprise email that makes your day, like the first sip of water after a day-long fast during Ramadan, like the first line after writer's block, like a student who can barely spell her name but pens the perfect line. You see, I live for the things I'm ready to die for. I stand for the things for which I'm willing to fall. We all promise that to ourselves sometimes. We, the people, most fragile of all. We, the people who drag nets to the shore hoping to find diamond rings in the guts of fish and pearls in the bellies of dragons. We, the men and women who stand inches from screens that scream at us to lose weight or gain funds. We, the seething mass of darlings and friends, rapists, racists, killers of men, romper stompers, heroes, fashionistas and feminists, protesters who swing their bats at the system hoping the shards form mosaics, and lovers who swing for the fences. You see this poem right here? This poem is for the outsiders, it's for the survivors, it's for the outcasts, it's for the eccentrics who never let coolness whitewash their madness. This is for the kids on the mish, on the pavements, in the basements, in the flats and in the schoolyards. My friends here in Mumbai, this poem is for you, because they will treat your voice like a crime for which you have no alibi. So make it a crime of passion. Raise it at their eyes, shoplift time, pickpocket perseverance from the haters and leave the rest behind. Speak, speak, speak with purpose, teeth brighter than a city's spine. Little wind though it may be, who knows, perhaps someday, one day, the fireflies will return.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
I'm glad you did that. It's amazing.
wonderful.
Yeah, he's going to read something, but I want to ask something which will sort of relate to that. See, in the introduction to the book, you talk about, I'm just going to read that. You say, wherever I go, my body carries with it the imprint of its past environments. But it is always becoming different in its new ones. It is always becoming another. So, could you talk a bit about this and also read, because while you want to embrace this identity of being Indian, you don't want to. You talk about becoming an Indian again and again in the book.
So let me just clarify, becoming Indian doesn't mean being Indian. We're all becoming. But becoming is not the same as having an identity. It means moving. We're all moving. We're all becoming Indian, by the way. We don't ever fully coincide with whatever static ideal there might be, no matter how hard we try, no matter how devout we may be in our adherence to a certain ideal of identity. My point is that for people like Omar, me, I think that process of becoming is made all the more apparent to us. Because no matter how much we try to embrace one identity, there's something else that's always tapping us on the shoulder. And this was something that I felt quite strongly growing up in New Zealand. There's not a very big Jewish community, and it got even smaller after I immigrated. In any case, New Zealanders have a very strange sense of being New Zealand. I don't think being New Zealanders. I don't think they have quite the cultural confidence that Australians do, by virtue of being that small little offshore island or collection of islands next to us.
They're way cooler than us. I'm an Australian who can say that. I really believe that. New Zealand got a lot of things right that Australia didn't.
But when I was growing up in the 60s in New Zealand, the home news was still news spoken by people who spoke the Queen's English to us. The home news from Britain. This was in New Zealand. And because I had parents who were themselves immigrants, I had an extremely strong sense of home being elsewhere, which is probably the reason why I played hopscotch first from New Zealand to Britain to the US, and now to India. It's not that I was searching for home, but it was more that my feet never fit the shoes that I was asked to wear. So I think there's a way in which being in India has really helped underline aspects of my experience right from the time I was a child. It's not that I have become Indian. It's that I'm becoming Indian. I'm taking on elements of the environment I live in, which includes language and culture, but also deeply embodied elements through food, through diseases, through, for instance, running repeatedly in terrain that, in hot weather, that my body was simply not trained to do. So, yes, I can never be Indian. I do have a person of Indian origin card, by the way, which I find absolutely charming and hilarious at the same time. My origin is Indian now. But the point is that our origin is always, to a certain extent, a story that we tell. We imagine that we come from one point of origin, that our lineage extends back through time to one starting point that is purely us. There are politicians who tell us this right now, that the language we speak might be impure now, but if we trace it back through time, we'll arrive at a pure singular origin, should Sanskrit. Despite the fact that Sanskrit is a mixed language that contains elements of Dravidian as well as Indo-European, Persian, as well as local Indian elements. So my point is that our origins are always diffuse and multiple, and that there is a way in which India has historically, in certain areas and certain interpretive communities, embraced that multiplicity. That's something I want to hang on to at a time when the zealots of purity are yelling a lot louder than they have in the past. And I think it's important for these multiple voices to speak back.
What would you like to read?
I'm not sure I'd like to read, so would you like me to read one more?
Yeah, people do wonder, you.
I can either read another interlude or I can read about a historical figure. What would you prefer?
What's more interesting?
The historical figure, that sounded really
Historical
interesting to me.
Okay, this is just the introduction to a chapter. This is an hors d'oeuvre that will hopefully make you want to get the main feature as well. So, visitors to Delhi's Jama Masjid, the subcontinent's largest mosque, must first pass at its entry the Dargah of Hazrat Sarmad Shahid, a much venerated saint who died in Delhi in 1660. One couldn't find a more typically North Indian shrine. Despite its sacredness, it's not a quiet place. The Dargah abuts a chai shack, a biryani stall, and an open-air clinic next to the crowded Meena Bazaar. Hordes of shoppers and animals, stray dogs and goats, throng the space immediately outside it. The shrine, too, is usually teeming with people. Many of them leave flowers on Sarmad's tomb. Their petals only add to the bright colours of the Dargah. It's also the resting place of another 17th century Indian Sufi saint, Hazrat Hare Bahare Shah, whose name means evergreen king. His side of the Dargah is painted in a rich emerald hue, and pilgrims tie green threads to the jali over the tomb. Sarmad's side is a deep blood red, the colour of martyrdom, to commemorate his execution by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. Here pilgrims tie crimson-coloured threads, and they slip coins into a padlocked crimson box inscribed in capital letters with the slogan, "Please," without an E at the end, "Give," without an E at the end, "Gift for Hazrat in this box." In a uniquely North Indian way, Sarmad's tomb is both a sacred and a profane site. The Dargah is colourful, but it's also dirty, crowded with people seeking favours from the saint for this and that. It smells of gudkha and sweat as much as it does of flowers and perfume. Yet this Indian saint was born an Armenian Jew, probably to parents of European origin, in a Persian city. His religious affiliation reflects this transnational heritage. He was a committed scholar of the Hebrew Torah, but his spiritual path also meandered between Islam and Hinduism. In India, he was regarded both as a Kalandar, a spiritually elevated Sufi infused with a deep, intoxicating love of God, but he was also regarded as a yogi, an ascetic who'd reached an elevated state of awareness and renounced all worldly attachments. Sarmad's religious identity has been commandeered by the official Sunni Islam of the Jama Masjid, by a modern Hindu sect known as the Ramaswamy Satsang, and by a handful of people who are convinced that he remained fully immersed in mystic Judaism all his life. Attempts to nail Sarmad to one religious tradition, however, must contend with his own self-characterization as, this is what he wrote about himself: "I'm a follower of the Furqan, a priest, a monk, a Jewish rabbi, an infidel, and a Muslim." The Silk Route trading culture definitively shaped Sarmad's unusually syncretic spiritualism. His journey into India, however, was driven by a more individual factor: his sexuality. Sarmad's border crossings took place on the Central Asian highways of the Silk Route and its Indian byways, but the fuel in his tank was a high-octane love, a love that had both a spiritual and an erotic dimension. Once he reached the subcontinent, all his movements were inspired by his love for another man, in whom he saw Khuda, or God. This man was Abhay Chand, a Hindu he heard singing a ghazal at a mushaira in Tata in Sindh. He fell instantly in love with him, went to Abhay Chand's parents' house and said, "I'm in love with your son, will you give him to me?" They said, "No." So he did what any self-respecting man in love would do. He took off all his clothes and sat for 30 days and 30 nights outside the parents' home, at the end of which they said, "Okay, we see that you are a very committed man, you're sincere, please take our son, but teach him Persian." That's what he did. He taught him Persian, but also Hebrew. Abhay Chand became the first translator of the Hebrew Torah into Persian. So Salman gave up wearing his clothes and grew his hair and fingernails in the manner of an Indian holy man. This decision won him deep veneration throughout the subcontinent, from Tata and Lahore to Hyderabad and Delhi. But it also led ultimately to his death at Aurangzeb's hands.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels actually with a very famous figure in Malaysia called Hang Tuah. I don't know if anyone's been to Malaysia, but he was a great Malay warrior, and he's now kind of been co-opted by Malay nationalists into this sort of this great figure or this great identity that symbolizes pure ethnic Malayness. Firstly, historically, he was probably Chinese, which they kind of, conveniently leave out. But also, if you look into his history, it becomes really obvious that he acted as a diplomat from Malacca, and he went to South India, and then from South India he decided to represent whatever kingdom he was dealing with there and go up to China as a representative of them. So this idea that he was purely Malay and loyal to the Malay cause that didn't even really exist back then is just so ridiculous. And I love it when these kind of symbols, you can deconstruct them and realize that actually, instead of representing some essentialized identity or religion, that they represent fluid identity, the idea of a fluid liminal identity.
I mean, this is something I found in the course of my research, that many phenomena that we regard as authentically Indian had pre-colonial Farangi contributors to them. So for instance, the Takde Tavus, right, the peacock throne, was designed by the only Farangi referred to in the Tuzuk-i Jahangiri, a man known in the Mughal court as Hunarmand, meaning skillful. He was a French counterfeiter who had fled the Basque country of France in about 1610. And when he came to Ajmer, he won service with Jahangir, who was impressed by the fact that he was a really good counterfeiter and said, "Make me counterfeit thrones with lots of counterfeit jewels on them."
Wow.
And he earned the name Hunarmand as a result. Another example, there is a Marathi Purana that was recited during the Quit India years in the 1930s and 1940s as a declaration of Indian nationalism and to a certain extent Marathi nationalism. And this Purana starts off with an amazing paean to the beauty of the Marathi language. It was written by someone named Patri Guru, who was deeply influenced by Eknath and Jananeswara. He was writing in the Ovi style, which is a local Marathi style. But Patri Guru was not born Patri Guru. He was known in Goa, in Rachol, where he lived, initially as Thomas Estevan, which would suggest he was Portuguese, except he wasn't even that. He was born Thomas Stevens in 1549 in England, and he had the misfortune to be born Catholic in a century when the Protestants gained the upper hand. He fled England as a religious dissident. He came to Goa hoping to do religious missionary work, and he fell in love with the nariyal, with the coconut. He felt transformed by the coconut. He arrived in India suffering from dehydration and dysentery. Nariyal Pani saved him. And the Purana he wrote is to a certain extent evangelical, not about any religion, but simply about the nariyal and its miraculous qualities. 10,000 stanzas of praise for the nariyal and the Marathi language. So these are just two examples of the way in which Indianness was constructed by people who were becoming Indian, but from a trajectory that is completely counterintuitive. The Farangi has always been part of the Indian. One last example, Ashoka, who supposedly unified much of India, who erected the pillars on which he inscribed the edicts for a just life. These edicts were written in Prakrit, a local language that was a more vernacular form of Sanskrit, but also in Aramaic and Greek. It's worth keeping in mind when politicians keep going back to pure historical origins, that at this moment of origin for India, what we find is something multicultural, committedly multicultural. That's the India I want to believe in.
before we move to audience questions, I also wanted to quickly acknowledge that the way in which your book disrupts the idea of the geography of India that we know is also quite interesting, because the stories you make references to Sindh and to Punjab in a way that includes a lot of Pakistan. And today, because of the kind of people that we have in power, we do have a lot of being Indian defined by being not something else.
Yes.
And the way in which your book draws on that idea of being Indian, which sort of goes beyond the borders of what we now know as India, is also quite fantastic. So can we now move to audience questions? Do we have like a mic that we can pass around? Just one of these.
Oh.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Can we see the faces of the audience, if we can? I mean, if you can tone down the lights.
I can see them.
No?
I can see them.
This one's for Jonathan. When I read about travelers to India, the first name that came up in historical references was Tom Coryat. I don't know if you've written about him, but I always found that story very hilarious about him being presented to the Mughal emperor hoping to get money, and then the guys just thought he was a religious madman, so you don't give like holy saints money, so they just fed him and turned him away, and the poor guy died of dysentery and he's buried in India and all of that. So can you just tell us more about the process you went through in terms of research for all these characters that you found for your book?
Well, I've got a whole chapter on Tom Coryat, the fakir of Ajmer, and there's a part of his life story that is finessed in narratives both by Europeans and to a certain extent by Indians, which is that Tom Coryat, although he was relatively educated, he spent time at Cambridge, he was something of a court jester in the court of King James. And he became something of a celebrity in England because he walked to Europe and walked through Europe in 1606 and 1607 and came back and wrote a travelogue. He was sort of one of the first professional tourists. And it won him celebrity. He didn't know quite how to top this feat. So he resolved that he was going to walk next to Asia. And somehow he made it all the way to Ajmer again, as did Hunarmand, who he met. Coryat was mugged on the way, and he lost what little money he had somewhere on the Silk Route. So in Ajmer, he was completely poor. And as far as we can tell, he spent time begging in the gullies of Ajmer. And he studied very hard the arts of fakirs. He picked up Farsi, and he picked up local Rajasthani dialects as well. Apparently one eyewitness says that he was able to argue in Rajasthani dialect better than locals when it came to small details like the Costa Khichdi. Yes, he was presented to Jahangir and he made an oration in Farsi, which many people laugh at, saying, well, obviously his Farsi wasn't any good and he must have been turned away with people laughing. What we have to keep in mind was that the Farsi spoken in the Mughal court at this time was in no way standardized. Everyone spoke with an accent, including Jahangir. There were people in the Mughal court from Persia, from Central Asia, from Bengal, from Abyssinia. Persian had become the lingua franca, but everyone spoke it with an accent. So when some guy from England turns up speaking it with an English accent, it actually didn't occasion comment. Jahangir gave him 100 rupees. People now say, well, that's sort of the equivalent of putting sort of one bill out the window of a car when a beggar comes and says, "Khana khayenge." But 100 rupees in 1615 was a windfall. So he was obviously regarded as not just a specimen, but someone who had succeeded in performing the arts of a fakir. So to research this, I had to again draw on the experience of my own body. I went to Ajmer. Weirdly, uncannily, I got mugged in Ajmer. At the Dargah, I had all my money taken away from me, and I had to, not for 12 months like Thomas Coriat, but for an afternoon, I had to raise funds, shall we say. And so it was an interesting case lesson in, first of all, how I was given a certain amount above by virtue of the fact that I was an English-speaking white man, without doubt. I didn't experience what Coriat would have experienced in 1615. But still, there was a large amount of negotiation that had to go on in several languages. One guy comes up to me and says, "Aap kya kar rahe hain?" So, well, I'm hungry. I need some money to get back to Jaipur, where I'm staying. The whole story is in the book. But it's just a reminder of how much our identities are the product of constant negotiation, quite literally, in situations of duress.
Is there anyone who has a question for Omar now?
It doesn't have to be for me.
So clear. I think it's been so clear that we don't really need to ask.
All right, that's it. You know everything about me now.
Any other questions for Gil?
You haven't made any reference to gender in your...
All right. Well, a lot of what I write about is to do with gender. As I mentioned, kind of toxic masculinity was something that I was keen to explore in my novel, Here Come the Dogs, which is about hip-hop culture and a certain type of aggrieved masculinity in Australia. You might have heard, well, I don't know, it sort of became worldwide news recently that in Australia there's this stat where 3 women every week die at the hands of their partners. So, you know, Australia's the kind of place that often likes to, you know, present this kind of shiny facade that we don't have the problems that other places have. But I think that there's something very sick in our society, especially regarding the way men treat women in very violent ways, going from slang to boardrooms to politics. Even when we had our first female Prime Minister, you know, she was treated abhorrently. And so it runs like a kind of poisonous seam throughout our society, and it was something that I wanted to unpackage. And a lot of people got me wrong and thought that I was maybe glorifying this certain type of masculinity because the main characters were all these men. And I tried to show them in nuanced ways and show that no, they weren't actually monsters. They were men that sometimes did monstrous things. But the fact is that, you know, I think it makes us feel uneasy to recognize that our society is permeated with these attitudes towards women, and the men who perpetrate them are not monsters. They are brothers and fathers and sons and colleagues and workmates. So that's something that I try to look at in my work, and just also, I mean, I guess it has an autobiographical element because, you know, I grew up in a place where we used a lot of casually sexist language, where you let everything slide, and you would, you know, sort of use a violent type of language towards women. And then also in hip-hop culture, I love the rap scene, I love hip-hop, but it is male-dominated. And so I kind of want to really interrogate that and delve into it.
Thank you. So we've just got a signal that we have to vacate the stage because something else is going to happen here.
Thank you.
I really want to thank both of you for being here, for sharing not just your work but also your deeply personal journeys. Thank you to Kala Ghoda, to Asad and Ranjit and all the volunteers and the technical team who put this together. And thank you to the audience for sitting here, for listening with so much interest and love, and for asking the questions that you did. Thank you.